Hi, everyone. It's so great to be back in a hall with people who might be interested in sociology. I'm a law professor. Thanks, Philip, for giving me tenure. I appreciate it. I'm a sociologist by training and a legal sociologist by training. I work a lot at the intersection of globalization, inequality, organizations and institutions. Quite a bit of my work is on South Asia, but I'm really interested in sites at the periphery, right? So I'm interested in actors at the periphery. I'm interested in organizations at the periphery. I have some projects on queer rights in the Middle East. I have a project on process outsourcing and how that actually implicates people and their lives and what labor looks like in different parts of the world. It so happens that India has been a big field of research since my dissertation was on India. And once you write enough about India, people imagine you're an India scholar, and then you take on that position, and then you speak on behalf of India wherever you go, and it helps that you're from India. But I want you, when I'm framing today, is a talk that's about India, but I really want us to think through how this can be about any site anywhere, right? And how to think about a lot of what I'm going to put on the table are concepts that I hope you'll be able to take into your research projects, your thinking, your analytics, like outside of what seems like an India story, right? The story happens to be in India, but it's not just about India. That's a broad framing logic to this. I started this project in 1990. Well, I wish I started this project in 1991. I started this project because I was really interested in a set of law reforms that happened in the early 90s in India, and actually around the same time that a lot of emerging economies had liberalization policies. And at any point you guys have a question that's a clarification question and not a longer engagement, put your hand up and I'll try to make sure I catch you and respond to it. But if you can hold substantive questions to the end, that would be great. Yeah, did you have, this is the problem when I'm trying to look at everybody, I want to make sure I've got you, but okay. So like I said, I'm really interested in how big macro changes that happen at a country level change the lived lives of people every day, right? That sounds like a very ambitious set of research questions, but the cool thing about keeping it that broad is then you can pitch pretty much anything you do as a version of that for a research agenda. And those of you that are thinking about doing PhDs, that's a good place to start. So I'm really interested in how big laws and big institutional changes trickle down to lived lives and experiences, right? So the law that I was really interested in when I went to grad school was the liberalization reforms in the early 90s in India that matched and tracked liberalization reforms in other parts of the world, where local economies were starting to open up their markets for investment by foreign countries, right? And what that really meant was that the global south was opening up for investment from countries in the global north. This became really important for people who were studying emerging economies because all of you know what emerging economies are, right? Yes? Sort of? Okay, so this became really important because new kinds of work and new kinds of capital started coming into these countries and sites in a way that changed the way work was happening. And that seemed to me like creatively a really interesting sort of setup to do research in. I was particularly interested in the legal profession, both because I was a lawyer and but also specifically because it looked like the changes in the legal profession were pretty specific and different from other kinds of professions in India at the same time. I'm going to tell you a little bit about why that was the case. Professions in general are really ripe grounds for investigation, right? Because it's where people do elite work. It's where people strive to get to at the individual actor level. They're trying to become lawyers, they're trying to become doctors, or they're trying to become bankers, right? These are the ways in which you get out of your early ascribed status. So professions are often thought of sociologically as a great way to think about how to think about inequality and a great way to think about mobility more generally. The Indian case was particularly helpful because like I said, 1991, there was this big liberalization reform, but it didn't happen the same way for everyone, right? So the way it worked out was some industries were completely liberalized, right? So foreign investment in some industries were completely at 100%. And then other industries were very, very protective about how much investment they'd have. So the legal profession was both interesting because I cared about the legal profession, but it was also theoretically interesting because a bunch of very important factors made it unique and distinctly different from other elite professions at the same time. I'm going to talk a little bit more about why data like this is important when you're studying stuff. It's exciting to study things you like, but it's even more important to study things that are theoretically valuable for other people so they can draw from it, things that are important. And the sort of empirical puzzle, so when I, just to make a point, when I started, this was not a gender project. Those of you that were here because you thought you were going to listen to a gendered project, I'm glad you're here for that reason, but this was not just a gendered project. When I started it, it was just what do firms look like when they travel, right? Like how does the imagination of a firm travel? And I was interested in the legal profession broadly. And then early in my fieldwork, so in 2011, which was like the first wave of fieldwork, I was at a large law firm, and this female partner, I was talking to her about diversity, and she had just spent some time in New York. She had like spent some time in a New York large law firm, and she was moving back to Bombay. And she said, and this was the exchange. So she says, the partner asked, how many of you walked into the room and have people mistake you for a secretary or paralegal? Those of you that know the context of like gender, the way it plays out in most contexts, that is a very common thing that especially women of a specific generation have had to deal with in thinking about how power gets decentralized in elite sort of labor forces. And so she says, to my surprise, everyone had a story of some sort that fed that agenda about how they were at a constant disadvantage vis-a-vis their male colleagues, not treated as serious stuff, etc. On the other hand, I had to confess as the only non-white woman from a developing country that I'd never felt the same pressures while working in India. If anything, being a woman was an advantage, especially compared to the US. Now, sociologists are known to be cynical, so when someone says something like that to you, you're just thinking, great, so you're probably really elite, and so of course it didn't matter to you. It's an individual level story, right? But it also was interesting the way she framed it, because she was going back to a firm that then I got interested in studying, where not only were women 50% at entry, women were like at 50% at partnership levels, right? And so not only was this an individual story of one person, it translated to a larger systemic story where she was going back into an elite law firm where she was really well represented. So that set up an empirical puzzle that was specifically gendered in a way that I didn't think was going to happen. But it also set up a new set of research questions that changed the direction of my research. And so the puzzle then became, why does gender matter? Like, why is gender different in this context? And of all you don't have to be from India to recognize that gender in India does not operate that way all the time, right? You think of gender in India in one context, and the result is not great advantages for senior women in elite positions. That's not what that equation computes to. So thinking about why there was this particularly distinct difference in one context became a surprise finding, right? So I was trying to work backwards from why it was that in very elite professions, in very elite professional spaces in India, gender didn't seem to matter in quite the same way. Now, when I say gender doesn't matter, the argument here is not that gender does not matter. Every site is gendered, every site is very specific to its own context, but gender wasn't playing out the way I imagined it would play out in this context, and that offered a new way to think about global sites. So Ethan Michelson, a colleague of mine in Indiana who was working on the demography of lawyers more generally, sort of ran, and this is a really grubby chart. So the only point of this chart, so those of you that can't see it, clearly don't worry about it. There's nothing it says that's deeply fundamental to my argument, except this piece, right? So over the last 30 years or so, there's been a striking rise of how many women enter the legal profession. And that sort of makes sense, right? There's this large narrative of how we need to gender this better. So there are more and more women joining the profession across the world. The sort of stragglers are really countries, India is like a main straggler, like only 5% per Michelson's calculation has only 5% of the entire profession is female. Right? So only 5% of over 1 million lawyers in India are women, right? That's the first piece of data. And if you actually use the census data, it's a slightly larger percentage, so it's about 10% if you look at the census data. But that just means 10 people have JDs, right? So it's possible that 5% don't actually work as lawyers, but they have JDs. And sort of litigation practice, which is litigating on behalf of your client in courts, which is a traditional practice. It's very old, it's stagnant. Remains an old boys club, right? All the famous lawyers in court are male. There's all these accounts of female lawyers finding deep sexual discrimination in courts. The data on the experience of a woman lawyer in India is pretty classic to how you'd imagine within different generations how women experience elite professional environments, right? But the reason this is distinctly different is because although overall India does really badly on gendered representation in the legal profession, in very elite law firms, India sort of is at par at entry or just above, although that number changes every couple of years. But they're sort of double at partnership, right? So one argument is that firms in India are not as elite as firms in the US. They're still new, so it's easy for women to actually rise to the top. But it's still interesting that women are inhabiting new, very elite workplaces in ways that they're not able to in other parts of the world. And so the question becomes, what explains this, right? So there's a large literature on women in the workforce, and it boils down to, and I'm clubbing very, very generously here, but it boils down to three big arguments. So the first set of arguments is women do really well in work that is gender typed. Right, so work that feels like women, essentialized logics of gender work well. So if you think women do care work well, right? So women are great when they are nurses. Women are also great at low wage work that men don't want to do. Women and other actors who are usually peripheral are very good at populating, right? So those are the two sort of, you can understand why that would be the case. Women do well when there is low status and there's not a lot of money involved because high status actors don't want it. Women do well when it's thought of as a truly gendered task. And then you're like, oh, women are just going to be better at this because care work is done better by women, right? And within elite professions, when women do well, they usually do well when they are within a subset of that profession where gender seems important, right? So divorce lawyers are often women because clients want lawyers that can represent their sort of side of it, and they imagine that women are more capable of representing other women better. Can you guys think of another example of where like a high status profession might have a subpart where women do really well? I know this is supposed to be a talk, but I mean, the only way to keep everyone awake is to also ask questions. Yeah, so women are like pediatricians and OBGYNs, right? Like, so they're more likely to be, so after World War II, interesting fact, it's not related to my project, although everything is sort of related to gender, but after World War II, women doctors were the highest percentage of doctors that we've ever seen, right? And then the minute men return from war, like it changes and all of the women go into a subfield of like micro-categorization within it. So what feels like a possibility for exposure then becomes a very essentialized gender type work. So data and design, I'm gonna spend some time on it, but I'm happy to answer more about this in questions if this seems like something you want to talk more about. I was really interested in, sociologists are trained to think across levels of analysis, right? So you can think about any sort of mechanism, any sort of outcome, either at one level of analysis, or you can think of how they work at the individual level, how they interact with other factors, and how the institutional factors that they're embedded within change the way they have, right? So in my case, the way to think about the design is like I was interested at the individual level in the kinds of schools they went to, the kinds of families they came from, how was class playing out, right? Because when I gave this story to, at the start of my field work, when I present this work, people would be like, yeah, but India has caste. And I'm like, yeah, India has always had caste. And it's not like all high caste women are doing well across all professions, right? There's something specific about this. Of course, caste plays an issue. Of course, class plays an issue. Of course, like being rural versus urban plays an issue. None of this takes away any of that. But over and above that, these high class, high caste women haven't done well in other sort of professional fields. So there's something specific about this these set of factors that are coming together to offer this outcome. so that was the individual level. At the interactional level, I was really interested in how they were facing clients. So I spent a lot of time in negotiation rooms, in with their meetings with clients. I spent a lot of time with their clients, a lot of face time, trying to think through how their interactions with peers, their interactions with mentors, their interactions with seniors changed the way they thought about their own identity, right? Men and women both, and how they were different. At the institutional level, I was interested in like, what are the frameworks that frame their everyday life? What are the firms they work for? What kind of culture do these firms have? Why do those cultures matter? So the paper you read really focuses on that top bit, right? So it really focuses on what are the firms doing to like set up a specific kind of space for women to like actually leverage a lot of the advantages they have from everything else. And so I will focus on that argument, but I want you to remember that that's one tiny part of a much larger argument, right? The bigger argument is that all of these things are working together to produce some sort of what I call incidental equality. None of them really come with motivation. None of them really come with intention. But the piece of the firms is really important because it's doing the work that other kinds of firms have not been able to do for India, right? And I'll explain a little bit about why I think that's the case. I remember I said firms and frames. So the frames part of the argument I've argued in other work is that there's something about novelty that's really useful for peripheral actors, right? So if you are in a new kind of organization that's doing new kind of work that's not gender typed, women tend to have more advantages than they might have if they were in a steeply gendered work site, right? Like I'm gonna unpack that a little bit. What that means is if you are in a kind of job where the idea of who does that job best is not fixed, right? So what do you think of as an ideal law firm partner? How many of you know law firm partners? Does anyone know a law firm partner? Ooh.
We know a couple over here.
You know a law firm partner? Oh, two, sorry, I missed both of you. You're in my blind spot. And were they, when you think of them, do you think of like a young woman? Oh, wow. This is what, every 10 years, I feel like this changes. No, do you actually think of a young woman?
Well, I mean, my aunt is a partner, so it's kind of specific.
It is specific. What about you?
Well, my mom's the one female partner of 9 other male partners.
So right. So
one at a time.
You know, it's so interesting. When I first started presenting this work, like I'd have my peers be like, oh, I don't know, like an old man in like a corner office, like with cigars, right? And this trick works less and less with every year, which is so wonderful because it means optimistically this is changing. But you can imagine that this idea of the woman like sort of breaking into it is still specific, right? So it's not an assumption that they would have been the ideal type. But in India, because of these new reforms, law firms didn't exist before 1991, right? All of it was just people doing small family practice or doing practice with in small groups. So solo practice is still how most American lawyers do their work, but the Indian practice sort of was specifically a function of they were modeled after what they imagined the American law firm was, or what they imagined a global law firm was, right? So they weren't organized in that way. But there's something about not just that they weren't organized in that way, but they weren't organized in that way and nothing preceded that organization. Right? So if something existed before they started looking like this, you can imagine there's going to be some tension between the old type and the new type, right? But in this case, there wasn't an old type. There was only a new type. Nothing existed because this kind of work didn't exist before 91, right? So foreign firms weren't trying to invest in India, or foreign companies weren't trying to invest in India or divest in India in ways that they did post 91. And that was really important. But equally important was the fact that they were both trying to do this, but they were trying to do this within a field where other foreign firms didn't exist, right? So it's not like new work existed only in law. New work existed because of the 91 reforms in a set of professions. And this was integral to my design, right? So new work existed in all sorts of professions, but law was the only profession where new work existed, but foreign firms didn't exist in India, right? So the regulatory mechanisms required that domestic firms would do the work. So domestic firms had to do very complicated work, and they had to do very complicated work that was new. And because they were trying to respond to this market that was new, that was global, that was sophisticated in ways that they hadn't had to deal with before, it changed the nature of the kinds of responses they had. And that, to me, became the big finding from this work, right? So, as I said, law, accounting, banking, consulting, all of the financial services had new work that happened after 91. But the idea of a global organization was in most of this, right? So most of them had new organizations. And so if it's just a function of, oh, all new organizations are great for women, Silicon Valley would be great for women, right? Like, but it's not. So the idea is like, not just was it new work, it also had to be new work that was not done by a global organization. And I argue that that specific set of circumstances is what made the Indian law firm particularly interesting to study. So there were 3 sites that I was interested in, like because of these theories of like what novelty could do, because these theories of how women's lives get centered. There were 3 main sites that I paid attention to. So I was really interested in litigation, right? So I was interested in what the old legal practice looked like. And when I say old, I mean traditional legal practice. I was interested in what newer law firms look like, right? That was the sort of main site of study. But then when I presented the old sites and the new sites, people were like, oh, this is just about law. Like, what is it saying about professional practice more generally? Or it was, oh, this is just about novelty. And I was like, well, if it's just about novelty, then management consulting firms, which are also new, which are also doing new work, should have women doing really well. So let me go and see if they're doing really well. And that was the 3rd site. So notice how at the start of this project, none of these sites existed, and the sites were iterative, right? So they all started getting added to each other, which explained why it took as long as I did to finish my PhD. But on the other hand, it was a theoretical sample. So I kept adding a site where I was like, oh, I wonder if this is just the only thing explaining it. Maybe I should go add another site. And every time I added a site, I was like, oh, if it's just a newness thing, then it shouldn't work. If it's just a global thing, it shouldn't work, right? So McKinsey in India, if it's just about being global, should be much better for women than a local firm trying to do work that just happened to be global. So there's something very specific about it. And that's why these comparisons become really important. So the data was about 139 interviews between 2011 and 2015, mostly in Mumbai, India. There were about 380 hours of observations over and about these interviews, and then there were content analysis of all the public sources. The main focus started to become, especially at the end of the project, successful women. And what I mean by the main focus is that the focus of the specific interviews, right? So when I was trying to go back and do repeat interviews, they became successful women in what I called global firms. Notice they're in they're in quotation marks because they were not actually global firms. They happened to be firms that were doing global work and were new firms. And then I added a sample right at the end of people who left these firms, right? To just be like, oh, what does that look like? If we know about success, why do people leave, right? Like, so maybe it's a counter argument of just, well, this does a really good job of not doing inequality, but doesn't really do a good job of doing equality, right? And both those are, yeah.
This is like a few slides ago, but what did you mean by consulting?
Oh, management consulting. So people who didn't have law degrees, that would have business degrees, and often would have, great question, would have engineering degrees, because that's the normal route to consulting. And it worked because they were global firms with local offices rather than local firms that were doing global work. So it was a way of like theoretically sampling what local and global differences I could leverage from the sample. But great question, thank you. And they were as elite. The sample pool was as elite. So engineers and the engineering sample was like as hard, the engineering schools that they recruited from were as hard to get into as the law schools that these law firms were recruiting from. So I was holding constant how elite the professional firm was. Did you have a question?
Yeah. Clarifying question. So you're saying the last sentence you just said kind of about the consulting thing to answer her question was that it's a global firm with a local office in India, not a local office in India being contracted by or doing global work. So they're
not being contracted by.
Right, they're not reaching out, the global firm is reaching out.
Exactly.
And that's where you're seeing this in unexpected parity in gender.
Yeah, and so the unexpected parity is in the local firm that's seeking out rather than the global firm seeing in. And now that the design is done and I have the data, it seems pretty obvious why one rather than the other would have better gender outcomes, right? Because they were responding to an audience. But at the time, it was a way to test whether it was just about being global or there was something about the audience that was changing the way people were acting.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay. Okay, so comparison, so women across sites, but also women in consulting. And I was interested in, like I said, the global local dynamics, but also client dynamics. I don't have a lot of client data, so really when I say client dynamics, it's self-reported data to what they said client dynamics was, but I can talk more about that in Q&A. And then, of course, law students, other professionals, and what it meant to enter these firms. Okay, findings. What am I doing on time? Like,
you've got 20 minutes.
Oh, great. Okay. So, as I said, so just let me repeat that difference so you have it in your head when I'm doing the findings. The law firms are local firms where no other global firms exist doing work for global offices, right, or global clients and global actors, because global firms aren't allowed to enter. The consulting firms are global firms with local Indian offices doing work for Indian clients. Right? So one is a traditional MNC model. The consulting firms like work in what you'd think of as it's like Coca-Cola having an office in India, right? And the law firms are uniquely different because they are still doing global work, but they're doing global work on behalf of like global clients in Indian courts, and they have a monopoly on who else can do that work. Okay, so this is what I'm going to do is show you a couple of main findings. I know you've all read the paper, obviously, so I'm going to do main findings from this, and we can talk more at Q&A about why this seemed relevant or this didn't seem relevant at different stages. So one of the things that came up a lot in the way they spoke about the organization of the firm was partners will talk about how about how before globalization, and globalization, by the way, it's a short circuit term for thinking about the 1991 liberalization reforms. So every time someone says globalization here, that's sort of what they're talking about. They're talking literally about the market reform in 91 that changed the way work was done. So the first set of notes was large law firm partners would say, you know how when they say firms before globalization, they meant lawyers who did testamentary property or company work. It wasn't transactional, so firms had to adapt, right? So firms adapted. Or they had, but so part of it was that they had to adapt to a rapidly moving market that required them to do work that they weren't used to doing, but they had to do because of conditions. The second part of it was that no one was teaching them, so they had no training, right? So because the foreign firms didn't have Indian offices, it's not like somebody was sitting there and like holding their hand through what it looked like to be a foreign law firm, right? This seems like a disadvantage, but I'd argue that actually that's the reason they started to mimic this ideal type that they wouldn't have otherwise done if they actually had a law firm there. So the other partner says, well, we had no one teaching us, so we had to learn. They've been doing this work for hundreds of years, but for us, this is new. We have learned, we've managed, right? So part of what I'm trying to establish here is that it was new work. It was new work being done for new kinds of clients, and it was very specific that these firms were cognizant of it. And not only were they cognizant of that, they were really cognizant of their global identity, right? So part of it was, there's no difference between us and them. We're the same, right? These US law firms and us are the same. And not only is it the same, people are excited about this work, and this is where magic is happening. So this is like romanticism to how they think about their own organization. But part of this identity making is because they're doing this identity making in a sort of vacuum, right? They're doing it both without connections to actual firms in the global West, and they're doing it trying to hyper-emphasize how they're institutionally superior and how they're institutionally global. I argue in the paper that there are two main logics that they were employing to like think about how their organization worked, right? So the first is the differentiation logic, which was, we are not traditional. We are not like these other traditional firms. And the second was a set of mimicking logics. And what I call a mimicking logic is them saying, well, not only are we not like these other people here, we're also like you. And both those things is part of like the identity creation, right? So the I'm not like them is a way of like holding one hand away from those that you don't want to be associated with. And the other part of it is like, oh, not only am I not like them, I'm exactly like you and I can do your work. And both those things was really relevant for that identity making. What this translated to, the differentiation logic, this I am not like them logic, translated to junior associates that work in the firm, to feeling like, oh, meritocracy is how this is happening, right? So the way they understood this newness or the sort of advantage of newness was thinking, oh, there's a route to a secure career, I'm going to be able to get this. only through merit, right? So this idea that like there was finally a space within the Indian legal system where you could like take a really hard exam. You take the LSAT at the end of law school, like you take some version of the LSAT at the end of high school, and so you're like 18 when you take the LSAT. So getting into it is, in my opinion, it's like the draw. Like, sure, you get into it, but it can't possibly be true that only 80 students who get into one of these 3 elite firms, and there's only 3 or 4 elite schools that feed into these firms. It can't quite be the case that they're the only true lawyers in the country, right? But it's still set up to feel like they are the elite students that are going to make their way into these law schools. And because they went through this process, they really believed that merit was what was reproduced in these large law firms, in these fancy law firms. And senior partners sort of would this was what happened over and over again. They'd ask me to look around and say, look around, like a thought like that does not even arise. And they had the numbers to back it up, right? So they could say, look around, like discrimination doesn't happen here. And of course discrimination happened there, right? Like of course gender dynamics happen there. But they could look at just the numbers and say, look at the numbers, we're so well represented, it is much better than any other firm, right? And sort of this is part of the differentiation logic. The mimicking logic was different. So the mimicking logic was and notice how when I say something is a logic, it's because I code the data and then I argue that that's what these people were that's how they were making sense of their experience. So one of the partners says, well, exposure, things have changed. We've been keeping up with the times. It's not like the litigating offices where people had to worry about connections or gender. We are like any international law firm. Merit is everything, right? So this sort of association to merit is how they do modernity, right? This association to merit is how they become a global firm. Notice how merit and gender have a really complicated history, right? Like, because merit does not always mean it's good for gender. Merit often is a way to keep peripheral actors out. But merit in this case sort of seems to work because the blatant inequality in the rest of the profession is so obvious that the one place where it's not as actively practiced seems like this haven for gender progressiveness, right? Although that's probably much more a comparative standpoint than an actual standpoint. And junior partners felt like not only are we doing this really well, but we're like any international firm, And it was hilarious because, it's not hilarious, I guess, but it's interesting that at the time that this happened, women partners in the US women were not making partner at the same level. They were not even close to being represented in quite the same way. But because their idea of an international firm was a firm where merit was the most important thing, the argument was, if they only have 30% women, it must be because only 30% of their women deserve to be partners, right? Because of course an international firm would be meritorious. Like, what kind of biases would be at play there? So the sort of takeaway here, and the reason the consulting firm, example was really interesting to sort of contrast this with, is how frustrated young women. So in all the consulting firms I was at, there was only one senior partner in a client-facing role in the entire country, right? So there's, and this is all of the top consulting firms. So all of the management consulting firms, there's only one female partner, and she was unmarried, and part of it was this argument of this is what you have to do to make it happen. And the frustrating thing for young women who were looking at those statistics was, what are law firms doing what special strategy are they employing that we don't have, right? Because while law firms didn't have, they didn't have women's brunches, they didn't have a speaker like me coming and talking to them about diversity, they didn't do any of the things that management consulting firms were doing, right? Management consulting firms, on the other hand, would have specific strategies. Like, they had on paper all of these things that seemed like they were really progressive, gender positive firms, but still they were having really terrible outcomes. So it was incredibly frustrating for the younger women who were looking at these statistics, trying to think about what they were doing what law firms were doing that they weren't able to replicate within their own firms. And I don't think I have a full answer to that, but I think part of the argument this paper makes is that the juxtaposition between the law firms and the consulting firms offers us a chance to think about what the global local versus local versions of the global might seem like, right? So on the one hand, You have people being able to say, oh, the culture is just different here because they're trying to distinguish themselves from their peers. But law firms, consulting firms on the other hand, didn't need to prove they were modern. They didn't need to prove they were meritocratic, right? A lot of big firms in India start with the position that they are global, right? So they can blame the lack of a good gender outcome on India, right? So the consulting firms could say, oh, we have these great policies and we have these gendered groups and we have speakers and we do everything we can do, but this is India, right? They could use the but this is India excuse in a way that law firms that had to hyper-emphasize how they were global couldn't employ. And that's the distinction that I argue made for a specific kind of organizational identity where firms had to overemphasize their modernity, and meritocracy happened to be one of the ways in which they did it. And gender happened to be one of the many outcomes that came out of it, right? So these are not feminist firms. These are not firms trying to think about how do we make this great for women. They're like, oh, we want to be global, and one of the ways in which you do globality is to do some kind of modernity. And incidentally, what that was resulting in was them not being hyper-discriminatory against women. And that's the sort of main essence of the paper, right? So, the paper tries to answer why they're doing anything right, and sort of I argue that there's a legitimacy logic, right? When you start from a position of not having enough legitimacy, you work extra hard to try and emphasize why you need that legitimacy, and what happens is you have some sense of how. A certain kind of diffusion of what is thought to be a good norm is almost always culturally relevant. You pick up those norms, you think that's the way to do modernity. And there's a large literature that actually shows how that's the neo-institutional literature that the piece pays attention to, is that the large literature on this shows that the global north has these great policies, but when they travel south, people do it on paper, right? So schools will look the same way no matter where you go in the world, right? Or sexual harassment policies look the same no matter where you go in the world, but their actual implication changes, and the decoupling between what something's supposed to look like versus what it is changes depending on where you are, right? But that entire literature starts with the assumption that when things go south, they truly go south. And I use south in this broad way of thinking about the global south, right? And to me, it was really, I still don't believe these are feminist firms, but there's something really cool to think about how neo-institutionalism might actually have something for us, right? So it's accidental. So the book that's coming out from this project is called Accidental Feminism, right? Where I make this big argument that, this is completely accidental. It's not meant to happen. But the fact that it happened is sort of cool. And it also really shows, it also makes you reconsider what this idea of the minute something goes to the south, how terrible it's going to be because it's going to decouple and it's going to be terrible. And it's awesome for a global south story. As a sociologist, all my stories are really depressing. So to have one optimistic story where even if the underlying mechanism, and I'm going to get to that in a second, but even if the underlying mechanisms of the story are problematic, to have an outcome that feels somewhat celebratory for the actors, at least in a specific point in time, is really interesting. So I call this, we can talk more about this in Q&A if you're interested, but I call it speculative isomorphism, right? So isomorphism is the theory that everything starts to look more and more alike, and the reason to look more and more alike is because that's how you show that you are legitimate. Right, so when you're insecure, when you don't know what to do, you mimic what you think is going to get you an advantage, right? And so that's usually you're trying to mimic the norm. And sort of in emerging country context, it's really important because that's how you show that you're actually modern, meritocratic. But I argue that here, because it was a diffuse norm of what equality should look like, or an ideal type of a good firm should look like, but not an actual pragmatic connection to these firms, they had the additional advantage of having this ideal type in their imagination that they could speculate would be good for their outcomes, right? So this is one of many ways in which they did it. They had fantastic, you walk into these firms and you'd be walking in Bombay, and I would go from firm to firm, usually by foot, and you'd walk from firm to firm and it'll feel like the city I know, and then you'll walk into one of these, I would walk into one of these offices, and I could be in Manhattan, right? Like there was no like true distinction. Like they all had really fancy art. All the offices were like clear glass walled. Everybody had the same kind of like notepads. There was candy on the table, right? There was like a bunch of ways in which it all started to merge together and look the same. And one of the many ways in which they were trying to be the same was to be meritocratic, right? Which is not use gender as a standard lens to try and figure out how they were going to differentiate between people. And so I argue that that's what global firms were doing. And the fact that it just happened, right? This is the managing partner. He's like, we truly believe it's a meritocracy. It really pulls up some important questions about how to think about gender and meritocracy and how that might not always result in positive outcomes. The larger argument, of course, is that it's not just this. Like remember the triangle I showed you? This is one tiny part of the puzzle. In the book, I argue that it's, there's this layer upon layer of incidental equality that's like all bubbling up to give this outcome. But it offers us a chance to think about, a city in a specific point in time. And I think it's actually, to me, it was politically really fulfilling to write something about a part of the global south is always thought about in specific kinds of developmental contexts, or often thought about in specific kinds of development contexts. So to study elites in the global south, right, and to say, well, you can't think about inequality without actually thinking about elites. And we don't bat an eyelid when we think about women in high status professions in the US, right? But the minute you do it in India, they're like, yeah, but like India has all these other issues. And you're like, yeah, it does. But it also has this outcome, right, that if you theoretically think of, gives you a new way to think about global south. You're walking down, so I'm gonna wind up. Okay. So it's frames, like I said, frames was the first argument. That's the first chapter on like how we have ideas of who a good lawyer is. It's sort of diffused in India because the idea of a corporate lawyer is not that strong. You have firms, right? Firms, this is the argument that I just made in the talk today. I have a chapter called She Just Gets the Job Done, which is a paper that's out on my website if you guys are interested. It's about how clients would talk about how women would get the job done, right? It's an incredibly gender essentialist and gender typed way to think about work. But because they thought that, and these were women law firm partners, right? Like they had better repeat clients over time in ways that did not change their outcomes quite specifically. And then I have a chapter on like families and how the work-life balance actually mattered because they had a larger dependency mechanism, both of a caste-dependent workforce, right? They had a lot of household labor, but they also had specific kinds of social movements that advantage one generation of women, but not the women before them. So they had their mothers and in-laws that were around, that were ready for childcare, and like, extended family networks that the Global South has theorized enough about as advantages for the modern generation of elite working women. Extensions and conclusions. So where do we go from here? Oh, I think I used that image more than once. Ugh, but it's a good image. The first extension is how do we think about novelty? How do we think about timing, right? So all of you are starting to, maybe you're starting to think about projects, maybe you're starting to think about just global studies more generally. And I guess to me, the takeaway here is how do we think about things like timing more critically, right? So when you adopt certain ideas of modernity and meritocracy, what it means to be modern changes all the time, right? So you don't just have, these aren't just stagnant concepts of modernity, they're very specific and they're sort of imbibed in specific points in time, given very specific nuances depending on who's doing the filtering. And so that's sort of what was interesting to me, but it was particularly interesting in this project to think about how we can all reimagine who we think of as the ideal worker, right? So it's not something we can carefully do, but this is an example of how when you don't have background frameworks of who's going to be good at a job, anyone can be good at a job, right? Because if you don't know what a good corporate lawyer is, it's possible that someone that looks like me could be a great international banking associate, and I was. And but if you imagine this, like that, if you needed my last name to be something specific or you needed me to look a certain way, it wouldn't have quite panned out exactly the same way, right? The second extension, and this is a pitch for my book, buy it, read it, make sure your students. It's the second, paperbacks. The next time I'm just going to come with paperbacks and throw them out. The second extension is how useful intention is, right? Like it's something for us to think about. Accident is great, but what do we do with intention and how do we actually move from, incidental outcomes to actual intentional policy. The third piece, and this is a piece that I'm thinking about, it's a lot of, I think, what my future research is going to start to look at, is how much of this is about optics, right? Numbers are really terrible. I don't know, how many of you, did any of you know what this tweet is? This happened like earlier this year. A large law firm, those of you with law firm family, no? There's a large law firm that sort of like had this, that tweeted about like all of its new partners, and one of them was a woman, and of course it looks like terrible for whoever the PR person was. Probably got fired after this, right? But then the thought is, how much of diversity is starting to become just optical diversity in these firms, right? And how much of it is a clean chit, so you're like, oh, I hired like 3 people of color, so I don't have to do this anymore. And the thing is, this is actually a firm that's great for diversity and has like phenomenal numbers, but because of this one tweet, they really lost like a lot of their local legitimacy about this. And their argument was like, oh, we just put the faces based on like last names, which is true, right? Like it wasn't like a thoughtful like argument, but and meanwhile, that was the year that 70% of the partners were like female in a large Indian law firm. And the contrast is really interesting because it reminds you that some of this is also the story that these firms are telling in order to keep alive their identity, right? So it's not about the individual actors, and problems like that it can slip into not being very helpful over time. I want to conclude by just saying this is a new kind of precarious mobility. Just because I sound excited about it doesn't mean I've fully bought into it. I actually have a lot of reservations about it. I hope we can talk about that. And the second is I'm really, from a policy perspective, really interested in how we can think of converting what looks accidental to things that are truly incidental, right? Like that, to me, that shift is what's important. How do we capitalize in a moment of, capitalize a specific kind of moment in time to leverage rewards that don't seem obvious? That's sort of like the second step. And the final thing I'll say is, despite all of the sort of, despite any of the red flags that come with this, I do think there is some sort of optimism that path dependency offers, right? So at this stage, these firms are like 25 years old, right? And they have a lot of women in senior positions of power, right? Which means the women that are there don't have to be, you know, on the gender diversity committee, right? Because they're just any other lawyer. So the path dependency that offers is that you're not a token woman, but also you can be a range of different women, right? So big literature on gendered representation in high status firms is that women start, you know, a certain generation of women, like, you know, the argument is, oh, they are worse than men because they had to fight so hard to get there that it's much worse working for a female boss than it is working for a male boss, right? Here, you could do that and it wouldn't be about you being a woman, it would just be about you being a terrible human, right? Like, and so that move that allows gender to be a sort of background characteristic and not the main characteristic for identity actually has implications for how we think of gender as playing out in these spaces. And I think it could have implications for how other sorts of characteristics play out. And so that's the optimism, right? The optimism of having enough women means that it is going to reproduce onto itself in ways that it's not just an idea, it's not a bunch of policies, it's actually in its lived experience. Even though numbers are not enough, numbers are useful in allowing us to offer specific kinds of path dependency. And with that, I will end.
Thank you for that talk. Are you willing to take questions from this rowdy crowd?
No.
Okay, do that. First one, there, over here.
Hello, my name is Swethaa.
Hi.
I have a question. So, one of the things you did mention, even towards the end, was that you hope that it will be multiplied and you'll see more, but I would be cynical here.
Yeah.
Do you think that because there's so many women that are in these elite positions, people might just go, hey, since there's so many women, let's start hiring men and, you know.
Great question. Great question. So, no, and not just because I'm being optimistic. It's very strategic. It has nothing to do with the women, but they figured out that them being well-represented gendered firms is a big part of their identity now. It's what makes them, you know, seem like, oh, that's not a thing that matters here. Meritocracy is the only thing that matters. So if they slipped in those numbers, it would actually change what has now become the path dependency of that identity. So that's the first reason. The second non-strategic but sort of institutional reason is that the law firms that feed into this, and I should have spoken more about this, are 50% female. So the law firm, the law schools that feed into these firms are more than 50% female, right? And men have other elite legal profession options that they can be at that women don't, right? So it's a sort of like, I think of it as an oasis, right? So women, there aren't that many places where very highly educated, like sort of ambitious women who are lawyers can do the work without a set of other contacts and be paid in this way without other kinds of social and economic capital, right? So for women who sort of are first generation lawyers, who don't have networks, who go through these elite schools and that's their path to mobility, this is the only place. So this is why the attrition sample was really important, right? So when you speak to people who leave, you realize that the men leave and go on and become partners in another firm, right? Like, or they become like litigation associates, right? They can become any number of things because they're not going to be discriminated against on the basis of gender for just being who they are. But both because women can't leave, there's even the 50% is probably an underrepresentation of how many women there actually are. And it's optimistic because there's a steady pool of how many of those women are going to come through. And the firms are strategically tied into this identity now.
Sorry, I'm going to
Take your time.
First of all, okay, my name is Natasha, and I wanted to say thank you for your talk. It was really energetic, and I love listening to you. So I think it's also great that women are entering these firms, and it's a small win. And I understand this because I'm Indian myself, and I'm very aware of like how that sociology works within India. My question is, will it ever be possible that women from the lower classes in India, or maybe even the slums, will benefit from this accidental feminism within the field of law? Because under capitalism, it would be beneficial to exploit these women of lower classes by achieving even cheaper labor to an extent. Like, is that the methodology that's like, if we're like going off of that methodology, would that be possible? Like, is that what's going to happen?
It's already happening, right? So part of what's happening is, so that's the chapter on like families, like how do the work-life balance get achieved, right? So there are two parts to this. The first part is the law schools are actually, for a range of reasons, much better at representation than other schools have been, or at least much better at representation than other elite law schools are, right? So there's one pathway by which low class, and I'm assuming you mean low class women, not just low caste women, right? So, okay, so low class women enter law school, and actually, you know, there are obviously a set of advantages why they're not going to be ample recruits for these firms, but they're going to be better placed than they would have been if they'd not gone through the specific kind of law school track, right? So there's one path to mobility. I totally agree. It's small. That's not the obvious way in which they're going to be advantaged. The other side of it, which is that are they going to be further? Are they going to be? Well, I can't. Your phrasing was so beautiful, and I feel like I'm mixing on it. And I know you've written it down, so I'm going to ask you to like repeat it. The exploitation in post-capitalism. What? How did you phrase it?
Like under capitalism, like we talked about this last class. Like it's more beneficial, I guess, like for like the system.
Right.
Like you exploit like women specifically because they'll work for cheaper. So like. Would it be? So
you mean women within the firms or women outside? Because I think the answer to that's yeah. So the women outside of the firms are most likely to be employed by the women within the firms, right? How many of you remember this California oh, maybe you don't. Like maybe like 7 years ago, there was this proposal to sort of, for most high achieving women professionals, right? The actual reward had to be like better family support. So like they could hire other women to like take care of their children, right? And I was like, okay, so that just means like women of color are gonna like have to take care, not do, so then again, it falls on women to do what this work-life balance is gonna look like. And I think some version of that is already pervasive in this field and in most of India in general, right? Like, so the dependence on low-class labor for household work is part of what explains why men and women both feel equally unperturbed by this work-life balance. Because most of the household work is done by women that are not part of the household, right? So you employ women to do much of that work, and you're totally right that in like late capitalism, especially under societies where like women are earning this much of it, like a lot of the work gets passed on to other women, so it's not helping them at all. And the pro bono efforts within these firms is like close to zilch, right? Like, so it's not like they actually have a committed redistribution of this advantage to people that aren't like them. Having said that, I will say that because the entry is through this law school mode, it's not a lot of people at all, but because the entry is through the law school mode, there is a wider net of who can end up being at super elite firms that didn't exist before and doesn't exist in other spaces, right? So, you could grow up very, very lower middle class and not have parents that have ever been professionals, right? And or be the first generation in your family to like do this, and still get a law firm job, which means individual level mobility might help, but systemically you're absolutely right. It reinforces the capitalist hierarchy. But that was a great question, thank you.
Hi, my name is Sheila. I noticed during your presentation that you actually capitalized some of like the...
You're just calling me out of my typos now? Oh no, I'm joking.
I was just wondering if there was a significance to it.
Oh, I don't know, wait, where would I capitalize it?
Like, there was one part where it said India is shining, or...
in my
Or like, it would be in different parts, like you would capitalize...
It's to make sure that in my middle age, I knew to highlight that for you when I was talking.
And like the yellow, what?
The yellow is literally for me to like know, that's, if I don't have enough time to finish it, it's for me to be able to be like, oh, I want to make sure I tell you that's the analytical argument. It's a cue for me.
Oh, I thought it was like a main...
I wish it was. It would like make such a cooler, larger argument. No, but it was really just my inability to like tackle PowerPoint.
There was a typo on slide 2 if you go back.
Are you kidding right now? Like at the end of a long day?
It's okay, it was really good.
Oh, thank you. Undergraduates are the best. Yes. I feel like we've had a question here for a while.
Yeah, they'll come around.
Okay.
I got a line going.
Hi, my name is Shelby. Thank you so much for sharing your research with us today. You spoke about how women don't have opportunities in other fields in India, and that being a contributing factor to them staying in law.
Oh, no. They don't have other opportunities within law. They have opportunities, within law. Like the first slide I showed you, there's only 5% of all lawyers are women, right? Because law is such a it's a deeply barren field for women generally. And so within the legal profession, if you want to stay in the legal profession, law firms are one of the few elite spaces where you can be and not feel like gender is a core part of your experience.
Okay, well, to follow that, I was wondering in general, then would you predict seeing in the future the spread of women in different opportunities within law then because of
great question.
the
Yeah.
success of women?
Great question. So that's the hope, right? So the hope is, that's the sort of path dependency hope, not just that they would stay at a high level within law firms, but that they'd be able to reproduce that into other sorts of firms, right? So part of what I didn't get to speak about it today, but part of what happens here is most of these women finish law school by 21, right? They come up for partnership before they're 30, which means they can become partners and then think about having children, right? So the work-life balance logic does not get impacted the same way it would in other fields, which sort of has real implications in other sorts of fields, which means they could be fairly senior, right, in their 40s, right, within the law firm logic, which is not true if it's like a much longer profession with a longer track to like how you get into partnership. So in their 40s, they could be seniorish partners, right? Which then, because these firms are so young, we don't have the data on it, but you can totally imagine that in 20 years, you see these women with extreme capital, both financially, but also social capital within it, then transferring that into other subfields within the law. I don't think they'd be able to break into the litigation market, for example, because that's such a that's such a deeply rooted field, but becoming general counsel, for example, or joining, or deciding to do pro bono and investing in social organizations after. It's totally possible that you might see that vein, but it hasn't started to happen yet, right? So I know some lawyers who've left and started somewhat NGOs on the side that they sort of contribute to pretty substantially, but I don't know enough. it hasn't been around for long enough that you have a cohort of hyper successful elite women who then are reproducing new kinds of power hierarchies in different spaces. But that's a great question. Thank you.
Another one over here.
My name's Nick. So I'm actually applying to law schools right now, and one of the things that a lot of websites like to flaunt is their 53% female average of
Yeah.
class profiles, and they really like to get it out there to show that, like, oh no, we're equal. So I'm wondering, how well does that number translate to actual first-year job opportunities out of law school?
Oh, in the U.S.
Yeah, both actually.
Let me answer for the U.S. because I think the India data is like what I just showed you. In the U.S., the jump is not post-law school. So we've been really good at recruiting students, and we're really good at graduating students, right? The slip is often what happens when they're in law school, right? We don't have very good data on it. This week I just fielded a survey on a random set of law schools across the country where we're studying networks of students within law schools to see if they're actually gendered and like race and other kinds of differences that people have when they navigate law school. So my guess, and we know this from some other data, is that women experience law school distinctly differently from men. They have very different kinds of like networks. They have very different kinds of outcomes. And so that's one part of it, which is that's where the slip is. That's where the slip of like where the number is not doing enough of the work of explaining what their experience is. The second part of it is, your question was, how do they get employed when they finish? Like, how do they enter the workforce? Women enter the workforce the same rate as men, almost, right? So entry-level associates, especially at large law firms, is 50-50. The slip-off is not there because they know people are staring at the entry. Right? People are always staring at entry because that's how you show good numbers on diversity statistics, right? So no one's going to do abject discrimination and not hire you at the start. What happens is, again, this logic of experience, right? So women trickle out of law firm practice at rates distinctly higher than men, right? So I think so the American Bar Foundation runs these studies called the AJD, which is called the After the JD, and so it's like systemic long-term data on what careers of men and women look like. And women, especially after 7 years, that's usually the number, don't have careers that look anything like men. So it's not at entry, and if you were only looking at entry, it would look like a very equal profession. It's what happens after, and the problem with that characteristic is that it's very easy for employers to say, oh, like we got them in, like, this is all on them. They had to leave because they had to go do this other thing, which is very similar to what the consulting firms say in India, which is that it's not about us, it's about these actors, right? Or it's about the country. We're not doing anything wrong. And it's the staying potential, it's not the recruiting potential. So the answer to your question is, like, they're very good at recruiting into law school, and they're very good at recruiting into legal organizations. It's what happens after, and the trickle effect after, that we're not very good. The leaky pipeline is what we're really bad at stopping. Thanks for that question.
Hi, my name is Flint, and I have a bit more of a precision on Shelby's questions, and she asked the majority of what I wanted to ask. But you did mention that, so these law firms are very old.
They're what?
They're not very old.
No.
So they're less than 30 years. Do you see, or would you predict that there's a risk of the men who have been at this for quite a long time, and especially since there's this outward-facing idea of protocol and paperwork, and what we're doing is very global, but within it's still kind of similar to how it maybe always has been, that they're going to just sort of pigeonhole these women into only really doing this one type of law and saying, well, what more do you want? We've already given you this. Like, no, you can't come litigate or whatever else. Or do you think that there's enough pressure from the bottom up, especially since they're viewing it as merit-based, and I hope that they can actually change that for themselves?
I love that question, and I love how it's phrased. So there's no pressure from the bottom up because there's no incentive for litigants, especially since it's like usually not repeat clients and it's like one-off clients. There's no, this is why I call it accidental feminism. There's like no intrinsic incentive to be strategic about gender in any other site because it's not structured in quite the same way, right? Even corporations, which is why I was saying, we don't know. It might. The optimistic take is that in 10 years it might change how people start working in these other, in corporations and like start to use their power and leverage it in other sites. But the flip of the, I mean, again, my prediction is as good as anybody else's, but my prediction would be that women would stay in this for as long as they can, because trying to like start anew in a new field where there is a background framework at this point, even in corporations that are only like 30 years old, they've still not been very female friendly because they've been internal focused. Women are likely to start only if they get very good gigs, right? Like, or if they have other reasons to like join these firms. I don't think there's going to be a giant movement into these other kinds of organizations, and I don't think there's any incentive institutionally to like support it, right? Like, and I am a cynic when it comes to that. I think none of these things are going to happen unless there's institutional incentives that have nothing to do with the actors in question. But I will say that I don't think it's the men saying, oh, we've given you this, we're not going to give you anything else. The men don't even the men within the firm are really invested in this, like, you know, equality, meritocracy narrative, right? So it's such a big part of their identity creation.
Just the narrative, because that's the other part of it. It seems like they were begrudgingly accepting, like, oh, it's globalization, cool, we'll play along.
Right.
And now they think, like, oh, maybe it's actually.
Oh no, but now they have, it's how it might have started, but now they have client billing partners, right? So they have like client books that like women and men have equally, and partners who will like clients who will swear by specific partners independent of gender, right? So now they're not going to be able to play that card, because now it's like, I think of it as like the late capitalism within these firms, because they're too embedded to like what the economical logic is for how they're practicing. But outside of these firms, because the same incentives don't exist, you can imagine there being a one-off case. But in litigation, I just don't see it happening, because there's like no bottom-up requirement. So Delhi is one of those rare sites. All of this is happening in Mumbai, which is like, you know, the financial capital where the firms are like, you know, the main focus. The way lawyering looks like in Delhi is distinctly different, right? Like sort of it has a very high litigation-based culture, but the social networks matter differently there, and sort of the meritocracy argument also plays out differently there. So firms there, even though they're well represented, because the litigation scene is so deeply embedded into like what the legal profession is more generally in Delhi, because that's where the Supreme Court is. Even there, the influx is not obvious at all. So I think that bodes really pessimistically for what's going to happen more generally. But that's a great question. Thank you.
The answer is old age and treachery will prevail over youth and enthusiasm.
Hi, my name is Amanda, and my question was like, what types of law are female lawyers thriving in?
Oh yeah.
Although they're considered like elite law firms, what types of law that they're practicing?
Great question.
Paid less relative to other types of law.
Oh, yeah, great question. I should have highlighted this. So the new frames and new work slide would see if I had a yellow highlighted thing, I'd have remembered to say this to you, and I didn't. The kind of work they do is very corporate and transactional. So all of these are corporate lawyers. So most of it's corporate lawyering. And then within that, they have different kinds of sort of specifications. So there's like project finance, there's like international business, right? There's banking, there's capital markets. So each of these firms have very specific subfields. Women don't, there isn't an essentialism into where you get staff, mostly because in your first year or so, you just rotate with a bunch of different partners. And then if you got stuck on a big matter, like that's usually what happens. You get stuck on a giant matter the first like 6 months of your practice, and then that becomes your practice, right? And then of course everybody like turns back to be like, as a banking associate, and you're like, yeah, you're only a banking associate because that was the first matter you got, and you spent your first like 9 months on it, and then you knew enough about it and the client wanted you back. So what happens is they have a lot of repeat clients that ask them to come back, and so the practice areas are not that gender type because the whole thing is new, and so it's not as gender type. But do they get paid differently? That was the second part of your question. Do they get, yeah. And so no, because they work on a lockstep compensation system where everybody, depending on what level you are in, get paid the same. The real black box is where it comes to bonuses, right? Like, and we know across the board that's where there are differences. But because these are smaller firms, most people know what the range of bonuses are, and women the firms that I'm thinking of, especially for the time I'm thinking of, the women I spoke to like completely, hit their bonuses out of the ballpark, like in ways that their male colleagues were not. So not only were they doing it the same rate as men, but they were doing much better, mostly because they were bringing in more business. So it had nothing to do with the kind of work, although the kind of work mattered in terms of thinking of women as good for doing this kind of work. But the subfield within that didn't matter as much as I thought it would matter. But that's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you for coming.
My name is Nima, and I had a two-part question. So I was wondering if you could speak a little more on the work culture within these forms, particularly in terms of interpersonal relationships, and whether that kind of had an implication for changing the culture of law within these forms. Which takes me to my related question of also, like, what is informing this idea of the ideal type that these forms seem to be drawing upon in order to constitute their identities? Because like, it was quite clear from your presentation that like the global as they are imagining is an ideal type and not something that's existing in the world we are.
Yeah, great question. Thank you so much. Yeah.
I wasn't going to ask a question because I didn't do the reading.
What?
I had the class late and Professor McCarthy never replies to my emails.
It's always the faculty.
Okay, so I just want to sort of...
Can't believe it. I'm actually hurt. My heart hurts.
So, my question is sort of related, also a little bit different, but you can just answer a little bit out of order.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about what kinds, and I'm sure you thought about this if it's in the reading or not, what kinds of erasures become possible because of this speculative isomorphism in terms of diversity, right? So I'm thinking about obviously religious minorities.
Oh my God,
like,
yeah.
Even the whole India shining slogan, I don't have time to explain, but I'm sure you can.
I'm totally not, this is the other reason it was in yellow. I was like, if I have more time, I'm totally going to go into that.
Right. So, I mean, thinking about like, does the fact that these firms have 50% women in partner positions make it possible for them to ignore or sort of willfully ignore possibilities of diversity in hiring when it comes to religious minorities, or even sort of, let's say, Muslim women, Dalit women, etc. I'm presuming most of these are elite Hindu women, so
they're not actually.
Oh, they're not. Okay.
They're not always. Yeah. Great question. Great question. Let me start from the end, just because it like trickles out. So they're not all elite Hindu women because law schools don't recruit just elite Hindu women for a range of. So the feeding pool is more diverse than it would have been. Like, I mean, left to them, it would have just been networks, right? Like, think about it. If you didn't have this is the other bit I forgot, probably is relevant, is that the law school started at the same time the law firm started. So not only were the law firms brand new, the law schools are also post-91 creations, right? So they're both neoliberal creations that are feeding off of each other. That, interestingly, the law schools were set up to be public interest schools. That's not what they're feeding. But they are also, more diverse, and therefore the feeder pool it's still majority Hindu women, but there is more of a representation of low class for sure, but like Dalit and Muslim women are much more represented than I thought they would be in these firms. The erasures that are possible, I think that's a really beautifully phrased question, because it sort of the erasures that are possible are not just at the individual level. The erasures that are possible is what, they, for example, don't have a maternity leave policy, right? They don't have they are terrible with like childcare extensions, right? So the erasures that are possible are really connected to the question about capitalism and women that they depend on outside of the firm, because they don't have, because they are on paper represented really well, everything then becomes a one-on-one negotiation. And this goes to your point about interactions within the firm. It's like whether you can negotiate with the senior partner to like rethink it, because there isn't a policy about what to do if you have a child. Because most of these women didn't have children until they became like senior associates or partners, right? Because they could afford to, given their temporal like life clocks and their work clocks, to not do that. And so the erasures that are possible are much more about what gets left at the altar of modernity, both by individual actors and the firm, and not just by the firm alone, right? So the individual actors too are like, oh my God, like I'm making more, I made more money in my first year at a law firm than my father did his entire career, right? Like it sort of makes no sense that much money should be available to a 21-year-old, but it was, and it changes the quality of your power and agency and like what you think of as like your ambition. So what gets left at that altar, the erasure that's possible, is your own future self and like what accommodations you're willing to do, that the actors are willing to do in the name of meritocracy. So it's not just the organization, but I love that trail. The interpersonal interactions within firms, I love it. It's an entire chapter on how again, this goes back to the law school logic, right? Because everybody you go to this law firm with is someone you went to law school with, you've known them since you were 17 or 18 years old, or these networks are like super, sort of, I mean, they overlap in incredibly incestuous ways, right? Like, and sort of, they are, the interpersonal implications of it that's building the culture is not so much that they get built in the firm, they're built before you enter the firm, right? So what happens is a reproduction of that sort of elite school culture that happens within these firms that then crystallizes what you think of as merit and what you think of as modern, like from a ground up level within these firms, rather than it being something that's like pressed down upon them from the outside. And the ideal type question, this is why I struggled with like what to call this paper, right? So the fact that it's called speculative isomorphism, I was like, it's a mouthful, like, so the reviewers went back and forth about whether it was useful, but I do think that's what's happening here. The fact that the ideal type was not known to them meant it was a diffused ideal type, right? So it was a speculation of what the ideal type even was. And if they thought this ideal type was terrible to women, right, or like didn't care about women, they would not have been great to women. So it's like, it just so happens that this is one of the things they threw at the wall, and it's one of the things that stuck because of a range of factors that had nothing to do with them, which is why it was speculative. But the notion of the ideal type, I insist, is not about gender, it's about meritocracy. It's about modernity, it's about meritocracy, and that sort of relationship between meritocracy and women is so distinctly different from what we think of as the normal relationship between meritocracy and women. And if they had more information, they'd know. I have to stop. Oh, I don't have to stop?
One more question.
Oh, we're yeah. I thought this was ended at 6:15, so I was worried.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. Really appreciate that, and Zoe. And I want to ask so you mentioned the class and family background, education resources help to improve gender equality and maybe social equality too. And I want to ask, how does the appearance of female elites transform to the current cases, and also to legalization in India? How does this help to solve some social problems in the
Wait, did you ask me a question about parents before you asked about the social problems, or did I just imagine it? Wait, the first part of the question was about parents? No.
No. Just how does maybe this female elites, their appearance, how does it help to transform to the current cases, maybe the legal systems?
Yeah. How their appearance has changed the current. Okay, got it. I was hoping it was a question about parents, because that's like one of my favorite extensions to this. So their appearances. So they don't do a lot of work in courts, right? So their actual appearance in litigation doesn't matter in quite the same way. But this goes back to an earlier question that I answered about how power within these firms can get translated into doing really well, having more money at your disposal to invest in other causes. And a lot of these women partners, again, as corporate social responsibility extends to elite pro bono that happens in these firms, not structured, but happens. And some of them choose gendered causes, but it's not systematic. It's definitely not it's not required out of these women, and it's not a priority. So the questions that you guys are thinking about, all of your super articulate extensions to what good and beauty this can put out in the world, are not being thought in the lived sort of 18-hour-a-day work lives of these women, right? They're also just thinking of, I can't believe I'm living this life that my parents could not have dreamed that I would live. And that's one part of it. But another part of it is just that is not, it's interesting that that's not where the investment to these outcomes are going. Some women left to join policy firms that would do social justice stuff, and that's sort of a tiny, 3 people in my sample left to join policy firms in different places, but usually they did it because their husbands were moving cities and they were moving to another city, and then they had to find a new job, and they're like, I don't think I want to be a law firm associate for a single other hour of my life. But it wasn't because they suddenly realized that reinvesting in society was what was called to them.
Okay, we're out of time.
Thank you.